Welcome to the Coping Podcast, where we share strategies for coping with the stressors of life, especially the difficulties of parenting. And here is your host, Dr. Lee Weiss.
This is Dr. Lee Weiss. I am the host of the Coping Podcast, where I feature top experts on topics like raising healthy children, parenting, and so much more. Past guests include therapists Dr. Aaron Fromm and Ben Kessler, dietitian Lara Field, and many more. Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided is for educational and informational purposes only. This is not intended to provide mental health treatment and does not constitute a client-therapist relationship. The information provided is not a replacement for being assessed and evaluated by a licensed professional and is not intended to replace mental health or medical advice. Before we get into today's topic, I wanted to introduce our guest, who is an amazing individual, someone who truly embodies tikkun olam, the Hebrew expression for repairing the world. Rabbi Geffen is the Senior Rabbi of North Shore Congregation, Israel, and has been part of the rabbinic team there since 2002. Rabbi Geffen is a tireless leader of our community, a person who people turn to for counsel, education, and insight. She promotes a larger sense of purpose and impact in the world's repair. There are many things that inspire Rabbi Geffen. She's passionate about how Jewish wisdom adds meaning to our lives and enables us to better our world each day. As a rabbi, she is dedicated to empowering each person to define their Jewish identity and Jewish journey. And as a senior staff member, Rabbi Geffen empowers the synagogue and the larger Jewish community to pursue justice and the repair of the world. She also likes to cheer alongside her husband, Scott, for their children at a dance recital or a baseball game. And beyond her leadership at NSCI, Rabbi Geffen is a leader in the national Jewish community. She is on the executive board of the Chicago Board of Rabbis. She serves on a number of local Jewish and communal boards and is a frequent commentator to the press on issues of national importance. So thank you, Rabbi Geffen, so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Weiss.
You're welcome. You and I had talked previously about some of the things that both of us are hearing about. One of them is how parents are presenting to us feeling so overwhelmed with worry about how our children can possibly feel safe in the world in which they're growing up. And I think this is true for most people raising kids these days, but perhaps particularly for the Jewish community more recently. So I wanted to see if you would start by just telling us what are some of the most common questions and concerns you're getting from parents.
So thank you so much. I think as you just insinuated, this is something that is, I think, experienced by everybody in some way. And so I name that as to say, like, often when we speak about parents, we're assuming that they exist only in the role of who they are in relation to the fact that they have a child or children. But parents are people too. So whenever anyone is presenting someone, I'm always sort of trying to be sensitive to the fact that what our kids are experiencing, often we are also experiencing. And it's not always easy to kind of like separate those experiences or those feelings out. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the questions as they first present themselves, or the concerns, maybe even better said, as they first present themselves, surround really whatever the issue is and kind of channeling it into equating that the entire world is unhinged, unsafe, and that therefore means that their child is unsafe, and the concerns that come with that. Sometimes a parent is kind of approaching me in this case because their child has expressed a concern. But I would say more often than not, the parent is either preparing themselves for a case when they imagine their child will come forward, or is kind of projecting their concerns justifiably onto what their child they think must be experiencing and or thinking. And sometimes that might be the case, and sometimes it's not, right? And that even that just is hard to discern. But I think a lot of the questions are things like, you know, first of all, in the Jewish context, should I be sending my child to, I think about like in the weeks after October 7th. And the truth is, this also happened in the weeks after Pittsburgh and the Tree of Life shooting. It actually happened in the weeks after Colleyville as well. So these are things that kind of, reflecting on it now, take us all the way back to 2018. So this has been going on in a Jewish kind of mindset for a while now, of just the direct concern about the security threat that is present ubiquitously in the Jewish community. And so for any one of us, in particular in the Midwest, who knew Jewish life before Pittsburgh,
right,
that there's a really big delineator where it became super common after Pittsburgh to see security guards, police cars, all sorts of protective security measures upon entry and throughout one's experience in Jewish spaces, whether that be synagogues, Jewish organizations, what have you.
right,
And that's real.
right.
And I would say necessary. But we have to know that that comes with a consequence in terms of, if we want people to perceive of a synagogue as a safe space, a comfortable space, a home, how many people's homes have security guards before you go in?
Right.
So just that alone, I think, is a big question for parents that comes to us, which is like, should I really be sending my child to these Jewishly identified spaces? And obviously it's, the question is coming from the place of concern for not the child's emotional well-being, but literally their physical safety. And I just kind of want to honor that is a pretty ubiquitous question. And it has only increased. I mean, and that increased exponentially after October 7th.
Yeah.
And I would just say, somewhat uniquely in our North Shore community, we also saw a big bump of that sort of question, not connected to Jewish identity, but safety in general, after our July 4th shooting in Highland Park, which continues to devastate, specifically our community. So there's that kind of like just the straight, literal question about safety.
Yeah. And
Right.
again, what you're saying is, first of all, we always think about anxiety as being, I think of like the bad anxiety, so the irrational parts. But obviously there is some anxiety that's wired into us for survival for a good reason. And it's good, it's healthy. And so I hear you saying that some of this, is legit. We do have to unfortunately think about these kinds of issues in order to stay safe. And yet we also need to figure out a way to live our lives and to kind of balance it. And I know you are the most non-judgmental. It's one of the things I love about you when you speak to, everyone. You say there's no one size fits all. There's no right or wrong. But you help people kind of figure out for themselves what the best choice is. But I do think about, for the kids, for the parents, it's important to parcel out their own anxiety from their kids' anxiety.
For sure. And, I think even in those questions, if a parent comes and says, my child is worried about coming to the synagogue, that is a different conversation than a parent simply asking, should I be sending my child? Right? It's different kind of levels of agency.
Right.
And I think the conversation around those questions and then whatever answers or possibilities might be revealed is different because it's also subjective and it depends on the family, the child, the parent, what's actually happening in a given moment. But even in that kind of first layer question, there is, as you say, this anxiety because although it's true, we can never guarantee anybody's safety in the world. And that's been true for all time, right? This not just feels more proximate, it is more proximate. And it isn't an irrational fear.
Right.
You know, if our fight or flight instincts are activated by a tiger chasing us, we've literally had tigers chasing us. It's not a phantom tiger.
Right.
And so just kind of want to honor the intensity of it. It's why I begin with the reality, right? I think once we get beyond those sorts of questions, and I can come back to talk about potential responses, right? But then there are the questions of, actual anxiety, concern that becomes more diffuse and almost like ubiquitous without without an expressed concrete concern or like motivating factor. So less about like, is it safe to send my child, but more about, I feel that my child is growing up in an era or is experiencing things which will permanently affect them to the negative. Or I see it already affecting them to the negative. Or how can I prepare them better to navigate in a world which is, and then the language will be unhinged, utterly unsafe, very really
extremes,
difficult, extreme language. And that, I would say that's the most common trope. And then you kind of fill in the blank to like what is likely triggering that. So when I think about kind of these navigations over the last few years, thinking about it now, I would cite actually Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life shooting as kind of like marker one. But then there was COVID.
Right.
Which is
so many
I
things.
Can't believe that all happened, but that happened. And I think in particular for people who were or perceived that their children were encountering lockdowns at a time of high developmental possibility, that really became a major vessel into which to channel anxieties for which there really weren't answers yet because nobody knew what the effects of any of this were going to be. I don't know that I think we still don't know.
Right.
We're just
the
starting.
Fear is, the concern is like, will my child be okay?
Exactly.
That's at the end of the day, that's what parents were worried about.
Yeah, exactly. And so then I think after COVID, there's July 4th, and then certainly in the Jewish community, there's October 7th, which I would say in the Jewish framework is the most radical flipping upside down of kind of how one navigates Jewish identity in the world, and in particular in the community in which we live, which up until that point, by and large, had been pretty sheltered from kind of like a real sense of threat of anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
I guess I'll just kind of
absolutely, which is unique to this area,
Exactly.
So I'm going to kind of take you back to, you were saying after the Pittsburgh shooting.
Yeah.
If a parent came to you, and it sounds like many did, and said, should I like the should,
Yes.
You're right.
Yes.
It's like, there's not a one size fits all, but should I send my child to temple, a religious school, you name it. And I do think that parents were worried that there was like a target on their child's, that they were totally unsafe. How did you, really approach that with parents? Because obviously I know you weren't going to say, yes, you should, or no, you shouldn't, but what kind of questions did you make them reflect on, and how did you guide them?
Absolutely. So I think some of the initial conversation, and these are, by the way, tropes that can apply.
I was going to say it certainly could apply after October 7th as well.
Well, and I would say in the kind of like discernment questions, which is, I think, really, for me, at least the starting place in any conversation, I think are tools that can be used in any kind of anxiety provoking scenario, just for what it's worth. But I think the first one is to discern what's real in a person, like if it's the parent, for the parent, and then for what they understand of the child, assuming the child's not actually in that conversation, right? Some parents brought their children to have this conversation, and obviously those were children of, a certain age and older, but it's not that children can't be a part of that conversation. It depends on the child, right? But so for some parents, if they kind of slowed down and said, okay, so what is the situation we're actually talking about? We're talking about, in our case, should I send my child to religious school at our synagogue here in the suburbs of Chicago, right? Is what's going on? Is there an active threat here, right? Let's discern that. And thank God there was not, right? Often we would talk about like, what would you need to hear as the parent to assure you that this was a different scenario from your worst case fear, which is fueling the concern. So discernment, right? Then the question goes to the student or the child, which is, how is the child manifesting concern explicitly, or do you feel that you sense it? How? And really that then becomes the balance of the parent. If a child is in full anxiety panic mode, there's not a lot of cases where I would say, and you should push them through and force them to come to religious school, right? But if a child is able to self-navigate their own concerns and even maybe had expressed some, but was kind of ambivalent about what to do, my direction would be to encourage families not to change their lives and not to cede their agency to fear. Even if it was a fear grounded in some reality, right? Again, always with the caveat that, and they have to, if we make it broader, the parent or the family has to trust the institution that they're navigating with, right? So like our institution is pretty outspoken about, we take security very seriously. We're not allowed to say everything we do for security publicly for security reasons. But I think our community has trust in us that we are pretty on top of all situations. And if there were a situation that wasn't safe, we would, as an institution, be responsible and not offer whatever was otherwise supposed to be offered. We would never do something consciously to put our community in danger. And I think that's the case for most organizations, and certainly these days for most synagogues. So some of that is just slowing down and actually discerning or analyzing, okay, what's real?
Right. What's likely,
What's likely? And what's my priority for my child, my family, vis-a-vis their life and a healthy life based on the values that we ascribe to as a family. Because at the end of the day, like, that's why people send their kids to religious school. It's not, any kind of enrichment activity is valuable, but in this case, this is like core identity enrichment. And if at all possible, I think it's about kind of limiting or pulling the concern down a bit, enough to create space enough to allow for some kind of normalcy.
No, normalcy.
Think about it, right? Like, that's no different than even in the pandemic, right? Like, all we all wanted for our kids, whether they realize it or not, was normalcy.
Totally.
And I don't even know what normalcy means, but like, it wasn't normal.
Right. Yeah, but that's what holds kids together, structure and routine and rituals, and to have none of that during COVID was kind of obvious. But even like you said, in the wake of these traumatic events where our kids do need us more, to have that sense of like, we're in control, you're safe in the world. So just to have no structure and not do the normal things that we would do is almost more, more. I like what you said about slowing down and recognizing, is there really an active threat, right? Or are we responding to our worst fears, as
Yes.
parents? I'm wondering if there are things that you help parents to feel more in control about, because I feel like, again, a lot of this is about a sense of control in
Yep.
the world in which people feel they don't have control.
Yes. Yeah. So I think like along those, exactly as your kind of question hints at, a lot of the process of discernment is not just about what's actually happening, but what is in my control as a parent versus what is not. And sometimes, I think actually a lot of times, I mean, I'm not a clinician, but my guess is that this is kind of a human thing. We invest a lot of our energies into the stuff we cannot control and kind of release our energies around the things we can. And I don't think it's a conscious thing for us. And I don't really know what that's about. It might be because the things we can't control are terrifying to us and we just take for granted what we can. But in these conversations with families and in I'm thinking here about, I mean, I can think about examples actually from any of these kind of touch points. But especially during COVID, right? Like that's where I think about this, like there was this like ubiquitous looming monster of this weird disease that could potentially not just hurt you, but cause you to hurt others. I mean, it's like just a nightmare of threat, right? And none of it was just so ethereal and vaporous, like out there. And we were all hiding from it, either because we wanted to, or we were forced to, or some combination of both. And I think kids, I don't know. I mean, I think in general, kids are so resilient and they can cope so much better, generally speaking, than I think, certainly than I think I can. But a lot of the question would be, when parents would in COVID talk about, and I related to this because like we experienced this in my family, like what's happening to my child because of COVID. And I mean, I'll share like a personal story, and I think I've shared it publicly, so my kids won't necessarily mind. But like my kids navigated COVID in their rooms and they lived their lives in their bedrooms. They ate in there. They like never left there. And all of the sort of normal habits of our family in the initial lockdown went away, right? And these are things that happen in our home where we were, about which we have complete control. But for whatever reason, we just let it all go, all of us. But and our kids, what do they know? And I remember one day going into one of my kids' rooms, and it was like such a wake-up call because it wasn't pretty what was happening in there. And I remember saying to myself, I'm the parent in this house. I can't expect that my kid is, if I don't offer any structure or boundaries, why is my kid going to impose them for themselves? They're a kid. They need me to do that. And we really kind of had like a family recalibration at that point, because it had become clear this wasn't an oddity. This was life now for whatever it was going to be. And we needed to control the stuff we could control. And that's not like spiritual deep. That's just like, sometimes it's just about reminding people that they have to clean their room. And that's the expectation in the little small world that is our family. Interestingly, though, that kind of thing actually can become spiritual, because when you do clean your room, you are claiming agency over your space. It's giving you a sense of power and control in an outside world where there wasn't any control, right? And that can kind of like diminish anxiety, can make a person feel stronger and better in the place where they find themselves. So I think like things like that, whether it be for ourselves, whether it be for how we navigate in the relation of ourselves to our family, discerning where we do have control. And even if it's not in the like meta values, but just in the little mundane things of life,
Mhm.
it's, those little steps, those are grounding.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
like, if you think about it, if you're in a moment of panic and anxiety, what's like a great way of kind of like recalibrating? Just like sitting on the floor and putting your hands down, feeling where you are.
Yeah.
And I think in the same way, like these little exercises of
Mhm.
taking agency in the spaces where we have it already can be a similar process. And it can be virtuous, right? Like you do one thing, then you're going to feel like you have a little more agency to do something else, to do
Mhm.
something else.
Well, and I hear you without you saying it, I'm interpreting that there's a piece of like accepting that there are so many things that are bigger that we really do lack control
Yes,
over. And you almost have to come to terms with that piece of it, before before you can kind of do the rest and make these decisions, because we obviously can't predict the future, you know.
correct.
But like you said, checking what the security measures are at the synagogue, feeling like, is there an actual legit threat to this area,
Yes.
or just my fears are kind of like running away with me. I'm thinking
Can I
about
add? Oh,
practice. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add one more thing just along those lines, which is like not eternalizing everything, like understanding that what this moment is might be different from what the next experience is. So, like in those conversations in particular, I'm thinking back to Pittsburgh and then in the wake of October 7th, really in the first, I'd say, 6 weeks in particular after October 7th, where that kind of like hesitancy or real concern about being in Jewish spaces or being Jewishly identified bubbled up. I think especially since October 7th, look, there were times where like it was clear that people were fully panicked and it wasn't going to be productive for any number of families to come um, together or to send their children, but that they might feel different in a week,
Right.
in a month, that this didn't have to be a permanent sentence of their relationship or their child's relationship with anything. It was
Totally.
just responding to where you were in a given moment. And I think that not catastrophizing for all space and time
Right.
is another tool that's
It is.
really important in our scary world.
It is like, what do you need right now? It's almost like
Yep.
after an acute trauma, what do you need today? What do you need this
Yes.
week?
Right.
But like you said, not making a permanent decision. We're never going to temple again.
Yeah,
We're never going to feel safe again, right? Those
exactly.
extreme words. And taking it to this moment, I think that's
Yes.
incredibly, incredibly helpful. There's a whole uh, therapy mode called DBT, which is
Yeah.
about being in the here and now and looking around the room and being able to pull out, what do you see that's red, and what can you feel that's textured, and what do you
Yep.
smell, like trying to like just really use your senses to ground yourself, because
Yep.
sometimes again the anxiety propels us to this other place and we
Yep.
are not able to make
Correct.
decisions. Yeah.
For sure. Yep.
I was thinking about too with the kids' anxiety versus our own anxiety. One of the examples that sticks out for me is with the school shooter drills. I remember even with my own kids when they were younger, it was so normal to them. They
Yes.
would go to school, they would do this
Exactly.
little drill, they would come home, and I would try to process it with them. And it was clear they were not needing to process it.
Correct.
I was. And so,
Yes.
and so
Yeah.
I again, it's like hard to understand because we did grow up in a different world than they are, but that some of this is not something that they're experiencing as traumatic, and we are. So again, talking with adults, to our friends, family, supports, therapists,
Exactly.
religious leaders around our own reaction, so it
Yes.
doesn't trickle down and we don't make it an issue for the kids.
And I think some of that, um, first of all, yes, 100% and more to that. Because look, at a baseline, we don't want to cause our kids, we don't want to be the ones to traumatize our children, telling them information or narrative that isn't their narrative. We want, I think, to help our kids form their own narratives in their lives and build the tools they need to navigate life. They're growing up in a time that is very, very different than certainly a time that we, their parents, grew up in or any other generation before, right? Um, And that how you say that we as parents should be finding support amongst ourselves and finding the resources we need to take care of ourselves, for me, sits at one of those kind of ideas that I just think sometimes we forget, which is we are actual whole human beings ourselves. We are not only parents. And if we don't take care of ourselves, ironically, it will create a reality where we might not be the parents we would otherwise want to be. But we are best parents if we are good with us, good with ourselves. And I think sometimes that honoring of it, it's the airplane metaphor.
Put on your own oxygen mask.
Right.
Right.
Breathe
Absolutely.
Yourself.
Right.
Again,
Even breathing is a tool.
Unless you are actually in a moment where a real tiger is chasing you, that's a completely different scenario. But thank God, those actual moments relative to the expanse of time are small and finite. Most of us live in moments where that is not the case the majority of our life.
Correct.
And
right. So we don't want to respond. We don't want to respond as though that's a perpetual
correct
experience. Yeah.
Right.
Correct.
Right. I mean, because it's not a perpetual experience.
Right.
Even though, and I mean, this is, I think, one of the real challenges with issues like, mass shooters, or even in the Jewish community, growing anti-Semitism. There's lots of messaging that, speaks to, for lack of a better word, the ubiquity of these realities. And even at that, they are still isolated incidences. Thank God.
Yeah.
But I think about our kids, I think about Jewish kids growing up today, and, the world that Jewish kids are growing up today in America is a very different world than the world I grew up in as a child in America as a Jew. And I grew up in Texas, not the North Shore, which had a very different Jewish reality in relation to its neighbors, but nothing compared to, studies that come out every week now about exponentially increased anti-Semitism, right? Which I think that becomes really hard for us to navigate. But I mean, I'm thinking of a story, we in sometime within the first month or two after October 7th, we had done a series of programs here at the synagogue to kind of like be a resource to parents of different age children to address this question, right? And one of them was for parents of children 0 to 5. And the conversation was just like a check-in, like asking parents to share what they were feeling. And, the parents were talking about how would they be able to identify if another child in their child's preschool was anti-Semitic, right? Like that's where their brain was going to. And we had to say like, okay, just let's step back for a sec.
Right.
Like, is there anything that's happened in your experience in this preschool to open the door to that, right? Is that a real concern?
Right.
And once we were able to kind of like analyze and parse it out, like, thank God, of course, that was not a concern.
Right.
And what it led the parents in the room, I mean, like we didn't have to say any of this. And it was me in partnership with a therapist. We were doing this together. It required nothing. The parents themselves were like, oh my God, I have totally brought all my mishugas to my 2-year-old.
Right. Who's definitely not experiencing, what we were worried. Right.
Thank God. Right. And these are people who are, they go to our synagogue. They want their child to have healthy Jewish relationships with vis-a-vis their identity. Like they want their kids to have that.
Right.
And it just kind of took that shared conversation.
Spiral sometimes. Right.
Right. To kind of get out of it and say like, oh.
Even just naming your fears in the community, or aloud for someone else, sometimes it's more helpful than keeping it inside. Or writing it down, and then looking at it and examining and saying like, so, where does this come from? Is this, like you said, an actual legit acute threat, right?
Yeah.
Or not.
Right.
Yeah. What about taking it to the kid level now? Because like you said,
Mhm.
there are some
Yeah.
kids who
Yes.
absolutely, or teenagers who are
Yes.
old enough to unfortunately follow the current event.
Yes. Yep.
How does the conversation look with let's say a teenager who is aware of, more information about October 7th, for example, than a little kid might be? And they really are feeling scared about anti-Semitism in the world. Like, what does that conversation look like?
So I think once you're with, I'm going to say like an actual teenager.
Yeah.
And I guess like not
Not
every
a preteen.
13-year-old is an equal thing, but I don't think this is the same conversation really with below junior high age kids
Absolutely.
developmentally. So I kind of want to name that because if a person who's hearing this has like a 12-year-old in sixth grade, I actually think it's a different kind of conversation. And my experience is, though I am aware of a couple junior high age kids who have been navigating some challenges. They have like some of them are children of Israelis. Like
I
they
was going
have
to say
like
there's some connection
very
probably.
specific direct connectivity, which I think makes them a little unique
Yes.
relative to our community, right? Where we see it definitely is in high school age kids, and in particular, once kids are starting to think about college, right?
Well,
Like, so the
and again,
older in
that's a
high school,
legit question of like, where am I going to
yes,
go?
because they are seeing, um, depending on where they get their information,
Yeah.
also depending on the school they go to,
Yep.
they may be personally experiencing um, either veiled or explicit forms of anti-Semitism. They may not be experiencing anti-Semitism. They may be experiencing people in their environment expressing, for lack of a better word, political opinions
Yeah.
or other opinions that are not necessarily or necessarily intentionally meant to hit back to Jewish identity, but that do
Sure.
or are felt as such.
Sure.
And in particular, this age population in our community is really having to learn how to cope with that because they have not developed skills
Yeah.
to face this. It's not like they've been doing prepare yourself to respond to anti-Semitism like they've been doing lockdown drills since preschool, right?
Right. Right.
I often will give the example, like when I was growing up in Dallas, from the time I think I was probably in second grade, my synagogue trained us on how to respond to someone if they tell you, like, and they gave us different anti-Semitic tropes. I mean, like where we were literally taught,
Right.
here's the response. And it
Right.
gave us a tool.
Yeah.
And it was less scary because
You'd heard it before.
we'd heard it before. We knew what to say. Um, and it wasn't necessarily uncommon. Now, this wasn't like violence or things like that. It was
Right.
just more what was
Verbal.
kind of like verbal and what was a common trope in the South.
Yeah.
I think for our kids here,
Right.
they got nothing.
Right. Like they had no inoculations, right? They had no.
No, and they've never even had to think that they needed to defend their Judaism,
Right.
their identity,
Right.
whatever that meant.
Right.
By and large, living in this community is such a incredible oddity for
Right.
Jewish people
Right. You're
vis-a-vis the larger Jewish
totally
experience.
insulated from the
Exactly.
larger world. Yeah.
So that, like the confronting of, on the one hand, I think is challenging. And what kids want to know is what they're saying true? How can I learn more about this?
Mhm.
I want to understand it. I mean, they're asking for tools to deal with it themselves, which I think is a great thing, right? They're not asking for somebody to go and do it for them.
Mhm.
They understand it as something they need to know how to handle.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, it's a very difficult um it's a really difficult scenario, however it manifests, to kind of empower them around for any number of reasons. And again, not all kids are the same. Not all families are the same. And I'm taking away anything in terms of the family's particular view on Israel, Zionism, Jewish identity. I'm just kind of glomming it all into one thing, but that can complicate it too, because a teenager and their identity, although they are looking to individuate, they are still very influenced by and subject to the norm of their family, and in particular, their parent or parents or guardians, right?
Sure.
So that can be really difficult. But I would say no different than the parent population. What we've found to be, the most effective place for creating some kind of resource for teenagers, and we've now done this with college kids, post-college age kids, is just convening them, bringing them together to share whatever they are experiencing. And I honestly think the minute they hear that they are not alone,
Like a support
it's
group.
like this
Right.
huge elephant just became this much more manageable
Right.
thing.
Right. No, definitely. I've had, we had graduate students who, again, like in their, the Jewish
Mhm.
graduate students come together and have,
Yes.
a dinner where they'll talk about kind of what they're each experiencing. And again, they feel such a weight lifted just knowing they have
Yes.
this group to be able to share these big, overwhelming feelings with,
Exactly.
and that they're not alone and that they can kind of rely on each other for support. So there's something so
Yeah.
therapeutic about that community.
I
Yeah.
do think the other thing that we at least have as clergy have been able to say is because this age person, a high school student by and large, is seeking individuation and they do want to handle things themselves, we have found that we are the ones who can give permission for them to know that like they don't have to.
Mhm.
And like we the clergy, and this is true at any synagogue really everywhere.
Mhm.
um we reach out to schools all the time when challenges arise to kind of help to educate or inform or support based on whatever needs are necessary. That like the burden of the defense of the Jewish people or even one's defense of oneself as a kid doesn't need to fall entirely on the shoulders of the kid. And we've seen that like once permission, like not their parent. It's
Mhm.
it's different when the parent is like, I'm gonna call. Some kids, they don't respond well to that. But
Mhm.
when we, their rabbis and cantor, have been able to say, hey, I'm gonna call. This is part of what my job is.
Right.
It's not your job. You're a
Right.
student. Your job is to learn, you know, that has also been a little bit of a relief.
Right.
We don't want to disempower anybody.
No, but
But
it's
it's a
an
big burden.
overwhelming burden for one
Yeah.
person, let alone a young adult or a teen. And
Yes.
so you're just saying, I'm happy to take some of that on with you.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Right.
Um,
Right.
because it's a lot.
It is a
Um,
lot.
it's a lot.
It is a lot. I'm going to ask you if you can tell us, Rabbi Geffen, one kind of last piece of advice for how parents can cope with whatever they are experiencing whenever we face these challenging moments and when their anxiety or our anxiety feels paralyzing. Because again, as you said, there's all these different events in the world that unfortunately will continue. So
Yeah.
it's not over for parents, for us parents, but
Right.
what would be one kind of tool or piece of advice that you could give us?
Sure. Thanks.
No pressure.
This is something that I do. I mean, I think there's so many great tools out there, but for me, um, like discernment is like the place where I find power and control.
Mhm.
And I find that if I'm able to get in a space where I don't feel like everything is out of my control, that it's just a different reality then unfolds. And I think that that's true for a lot of people. So
Mhm.
there's there's actually a really beautiful, it's a Jewish mindfulness practice. And we would talk about it this way. It's basically about remembering that you always have breath.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Literally, if you're alive, you are breathing.
Mhm.
You always have it. It's yours to activate at any point in time. And what intentional breathing can do is slow things down, can get you out of a reactivity, reflex, fight or flight kind of scenario and help recalibrate you so that, look, if it turns out you do need to run, you can run better. And if it turns out that you don't, there's actually not a tiger, you can calm and center into what is the needed action. And the way that this teaching that I'm thinking of talks about it is it talks about creating a differentiation between the match and the flame. So, if you have a match, right, it's not on fire. A match is just a match. And then when you strike it against something with friction, if you try to like slow motion that in your brain, it's going to sizzle a little. And then it feels like it's instantaneous, but then there'll be a flame, right? But it's actually not instantaneous. There is a lot that's happening between when you're holding the match and when the flame alights. And if we kind of think of our own selves like this, we're the match, whatever we're emoting or feeling is the flame. How can we slow down the kindling of it, basically?
That's a beautiful metaphor. Yeah.
And breathing is just like, so when we feel something happening in us, can we sit into 5 deep breaths?
Right.
Not 1, but 5, right? So it might feel like you're in an awkward pause, but it's just 5 breaths.
Right. Well, and even from a very basic like parenting standpoint, when parents are like, "Oh, I'm quick to anger. I yell so quickly," like, they could do the 5 breaths. I mean, it would work in almost any scenario. But yes, I always say you take your breath with you because people are like, "What tools?" And they, some people have like actual things physical things they use, but
Totally.
wherever you are, right? And some people feel awkward about that. Like you can always go to the breathing. So I love something. Is there a name for the mindfulness practice that you're talking about, like in Judaism or just
so it's part of something called the Musar tradition, which is
I had a feeling you were holding up.
It's a large, there are any number of like mindfulness pedagogies, I guess we might call them in sort of the narrative of Jewish tradition. This one is called Musar, and there's tons of other ones underneath it. But they're really, and what's interesting about them is they're really for the purpose of character refinement. So, if a person and that's where I think this can become really virtuous is we all it's not new to face an unknown world. The truth of the matter is humans or all living things have very little control, and that is the eternal reality or condition of our existence.
Right.
No matter how escalated we might perceive it to be, it's actually no different than it's ever been.
Right.
It just takes unique, realities based on the moment in which we live. So this practice, Musar, this whole thing, and this one that I'm telling you about, just like accessing the breath, you can use it proactively, right? To address and kind of harness anxiety. But the more you practice it, the more it will become habit.
Sure.
And it will find places in your life beyond just these reactive moments. And that will make you a more measured person. That will make you a less reactive person. And from a Jewish vantage, that will make you a person who's better equipped, not just for defense, but actually for improvement of the world.
Like meditation, right? You can do that, like 5 minutes.
But for the sake of something ultimately, which could be even beyond oneself.
Yeah. No, I love that.
That sounds good to me.
I think that's a great piece of advice. Everyone can do it. It's simple. It's just like you said, take some practice to remember to use that breath that we have.
Exactly.
And it does shift. I mean, from the shallow breathing to kind of like a deeper breathing really does change how you feel pretty quickly. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Well, Thank you, Rabbi Geffen, so much for everything, for your time and your wisdom. Again, I always say you are the most equipped therapist who's not a therapist, but I know this is what you do day in, day out with all of your congregants, and we're so grateful to have you here. Everyone, please check out more episodes of our podcast. Go to copingpartners.com and click on podcast and articles. And thank you so much for tuning in. And again, thank you, Rabbi Geffen, for being here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiss. Pleasure to be here. I'm humbled and so appreciative of all the work you and your colleagues do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Coping Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. And check out our podcast page at copingpartners.com.